Well, good evening and welcome to tonight's program. I'm Diane Kresh. I'm the director of the Arlington Library and delighted to have so many of you here this evening for this final program of our author series in the Arlington Reads program. This tonight is a special night for us, and we're delighted so many of you could be here. We're proud to say that last year's Arlington Reads was recently chosen for an Outstanding Achievement in Local Government Innovation Award, and this was from the Alliance for Innovation, which is an international network of progressive governments and partners. Now in its 6th year, Arlington Reads uses reading to create community by focusing on an issue or theme relevant to the lives of county residents. And all funding for Arlington Reads is generously provided by the Friends of Arlington Library, a group that we really couldn't exist without. So thank you to the Friends. This year's theme, The Soldier's Story, Serving Country and Community, is certainly timely, with troops still in Iraq and Afghanistan and the recent air action over Libya. This evening's guest author, Tim OBrien, has been called the best American writer of his generation, and his work is certainly some of the most important in modern writing. His Arlington Reads featured title, The Things They Carried, is based on his experience as an infantryman in Vietnam and uses the medium of story to present a parallax view of that experience. While the book is about war, it's also about the medium of story, how we use story to deal with choices we make, actions we take, and beliefs we hold, and how we create stories that save, heal, justify, explain, and in the author's own words, keep the dead alive. Stories that tell the story of our time in the world, not as it is, but as we would like it to be. The things they carried included the physical weight of such necessities as ammo, dental floss, canned peaches, cigarettes, Dr. Scholl's foot powder, rain ponchos, comic books, letters from home, and the weight of spiritual, psychological, and emotional burdens, nourished by survivor's guilt and imperfect memory. The things they carried takes place in Vietnam, yet its evocation of life's conflicts, both internal and external, is universal. It's a timeless piece of literature that continues to stir the imagination. Earlier today, Mr. OBrien met with Marymount University students and talked to them about the book and their reading of it this semester. And tonight, it's our turn to hear him describe how the things they carried came to be and how its story continues to change and evolve with the perspective of a new generation of readers. After Mr. OBrien's comments, we'll do Q&A, and then there'll be a book signing courtesy of Jerry from Barnes & Noble. So again, ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure to welcome our 2011 Arlington Reads featured fiction author, Tim OBrien.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. What a great pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming out. I want to first say a word about libraries. I think if it were not for libraries, I would not be standing here today. In fact, I don't think so. I know not. My dad served on the library board in my hometown of Worthington, Minnesota for about 25 years. It was his job as a member of the library board to convince the local county commissioners to fund the place, to give them money. And he would come home after doing battle with these commissioners, not all of whom were supporters of the library. And I can remember an anecdote, my dad coming in, I was probably, 12 years old or so, after doing battle with these people, trying to get an extra $1 or $2 to buy subscribe to the New Yorker or whatever. And having one of these commissioners look around the library at the collection and saying to my dad, books? You already got books. As if you don't need any more. If you got one, that's plenty. They're all alike. And as if there is no dialogue between now and, ages past, and that doesn't have to continue on. It was in that library, the Nobles County Library, in this small town in southern Minnesota, amid the soybeans and the corn, that I first began reading seriously as a kid. And by seriously, I don't mean Shakespeare. I mean the Hardy Boys and Larry of the Little League and whatever presented itself. It didn't matter much. As long as it got me interested in the written word and got my imagination engaged, it was where we all, in one way or another, start, whether it's with the, Alice in Wonderland or the Grimm's fairy tales, Thumbelina, whatever it might be. I can remember that library, if I were to close my eyes, as clearly and as poignantly as anything I can remember in Vietnam. And that library was as important to my becoming a writer as anything that occurred to me in the course of that war. I wrote my first book in that library, a book called Timmy of the Little League, which was a complete ripoff of a book I'd read in the library called Larry of the Little League. And by ripoff, I mean I just copied paragraphs and plugged my name in. Wherever the word Larry was, in went the word Timmy. My mom, I think among her papers, still has this first effort at becoming a writer. I think I was 9 or 8 years old, somewhere in there. I can still smell the Johnson's paste wax on that floor and see the ceiling fans spinning in one of these old Carnegie libraries that used to dot the Midwest and still do. It was a place of peace and of comfort and of quietude and of imagination, things happening in that library in my head that can't happen anywhere else. So here's to libraries. Thank you all for supporting this one. It means the world to me. It makes me want to cry to see all these faces congregated in a library. Although I'm going to talk about the things they carried a little bit tonight before taking your questions, I am not just a writer about war. It's what I'm most known for, but I've written other books too, not always about Vietnam, although all of them have touched on Vietnam in one way or another, and to a greater or lesser degree. I'm at work now on another book, and I always try to begin with something fresh that's new to me so that I can get excited while I'm here too. And this new book is about being an older dad. I'm 63, and I have 2 kids, a boy who's now 7 named Timmy, and another boy named Tad, who's now 5. They're my first and only kids. And I'm at work on a book about being an older dad, what it means. And it's a lot like Nam in ways that are hard to explain. That when I arrived in Vietnam, I knew intellectually I would die someday, but there it became immediate. The sense of mortality presses down at you at 21 years old. And I found the same thing happening now being a father. A sense of my own mortality is pressing in on me. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, it's not a happy, bunch of visions that are coming into my head. In this book, early on in the book, maybe chapter, I think it's 3 or so, is a short little letter to my first son he was about a year and a half old when I wrote this. And then after reading this to you, I'm going to move on to the things they carried, then take questions. Dear Timmy, a little more than a year ago, on June 20th, 2003, you dropped into the world. My son, my first and only child, a surprise, a gift, a miracle, an eater of electrical cords, a fertilizer factory, a joy, a pain in the ass, a thrill in the heart. Here is the truth, Timmy. Boy, oh boy, do I love you. And boy, do I wish I could spend the next 50 years with my lips pressed to your cheek, my eyes warming in yours. But now, as you wobble into your 16th month, it occurs to me that you may never really know your dad. The actuarial stuff looks grim. Even now, I'm what they call an older father. And in 10 years, should I have the good luck to turn 68, I'll almost certainly have trouble keeping up with you. Basketball will be a problem. And 20 years from now, well, it's sad, isn't it? When you begin to know me, you will know an old man. Sadder yet, that's the very best scenario. Hearts go still. Life is fragile. And so, now, just in case, I want to tell you about your father, the man I think I am. And by that, I mean not just the graying old coot you may vaguely remember, but the man who shares your name, your blood, and half your DNA, the human essence, the Tim who himself was once a Timmy. Above all, I'm this. I am in love with you, pinwheeling, bedazzled, aching love. And if you know nothing else about your father, know that he adored you. In many ways, a man is what he yearns for. And though it may never happen, I yearn to walk a golf course at your side. I yearn for a golden afternoon in late August when you'll sink a tough 12-footer to beat me by a stroke or two. I yearn to shake your hand. I yearn to say 9 more holes. I want to scatter good books around the house, in the bathrooms, on the kitchen counter, on the floor beside your bed. And I hope I'm there to watch you turn that first precious page. I yearn to see the rapture in your eyes. Right now, you eat books. I yearn to learn from you. I want to be your teacher, yes, but I also want to be your student. And I yearn to learn over and over again what I've already begun to know, that a grown man can find pleasure in the sound of a happy squeal, in a gap-toothed grin, in the sound of approaching feet. I yearn to watch you perform your first act of kindness and generosity. I yearn to witness your first act of moral courage, to utter that difficult word, no. And I yearn to hear you mutter, however awkwardly, yeah, I love you too. And I yearn to believe you will mean it. Timmy, it's hard to imagine as I watch you now, so lighthearted, so purely good, so ignorant of gravestones. But you are in for a world of hurt and despair and bitterness and anger and heartache and sin, which is to say you're in for being alive. You will do fine things, I know, but you will also do bad things because you are wholly human. And I yearn to be on hand to offer forgiveness. More than that, I long for the day when you might also forgive me. I waited too long, Timmy. Until the late afternoon of June 20th, 2003, I had defined myself, for better or for worse, by the novels and the stories I had written. I had sought myself in sentences. I had loved myself only insofar as I loved a chapter or a scene or a scrap of dialogue. This is not to demean my life or my writing. I do hope you will someday read those books and stories. I hope you will find my ghost in those pages, my best self, the man I wish I could be for you. Call it pride, call it love. But I even dare to hope that you will commit a line or two to memory. For in the dream space between those vowels and consonants is the sound of your father's voice. The man I now am, the kid I once was, the old man I will soon become. That said, I would trade every syllable of my life's work for an extra 5 or 10 years with you, whatever the going rate might be. A father's chief duty is not to instruct or to discipline. A father's chief duty is to be present. And I yearn to be present with you, always present, forever present, even knowing it cannot and it will not happen. There have been advantages to becoming a father at my age. I doubt that at 28 or at 38, I would have been so willing, so eager to walk away from my work to warm your bottle. I doubt I would have fully appreciated, as I do now, the way you toddled over to me this morning and laughed and gave me that first unsolicited hug. You knew I was waiting, didn't you? I doubt I would have so easily tolerated the din at bedtime, or your stubborn recklessness, or your determination to electrocute yourself, or the mouthfuls of dirt you take from the potted plants in the foyer, or how, just a moment ago, you hit the delete key as I approached the end of this letter. You are on my lap now, my spectacular Timmy. I'm using your fingers to type these words. I love you, Dad. Thank you. I think those of you who are parents in this room, and I know there have got to be a lot of you, know what I know about sex in the world, what we live in, there are a lot of you out there, and I think you know what I mean about now, having listened to that, what I mean about the similarities between going off to a war, facing your own mortality dead on, and being a parent, becoming aware of it, of what the world will deliver, no matter what your age. You could be 63 or 23, but having a young child under your charge and under your care brings on those same thoughts of what the world may be 10 years from now or 20. I'm going to turn now, rather abruptly in fact, to many, many moons ago to the world of Vietnam. My objective in the next 15 minutes before I start taking your question is to try to give you a feel for why the things they carried is written the way it is. And by that I essentially mean why the blur between fiction and reality, and the questions you must have been asking yourself as you read the book. Why is this stuff invented? Why isn't he drawing directly on his own experiences from the war? And why is he casting a real life experience, in my own case being a foot soldier in Vietnam, through the world of fiction? Why not just tell what happened and let it end there? The way I'm going to tackle this problem is to read for you a very short section from the things they carried as a way of talking about the book as a whole, just to remind you of this section, and then talk about why I chose to write this chapter and the book as a whole the way I did. This chapter is called Ambush. It features early on, you're going to hear the name of a daughter named Kathleen. She is invented. I didn't have any daughter named Kathleen when I wrote this chapter, and I still don't. I don't have any daughters at all. I needed a child to do what adults will not do, which is to ask the pretty blunt questions. Daddy, did you ever kill anybody? You must have. Grown-ups won't do that, for really good reasons, of course. They don't want to intrude and embarrass you and so on. Children will. And that's part of the answer to the issue I just brought up, why try fiction? When she was 9, my daughter, Kathleen, asked if I'd ever killed anyone. She knew about the war. She knew I'd been a soldier. You keep writing these war stories, she said. So I guess you must have killed somebody. It was a hard moment, but I did what I thought was right, which was to say, of course not, and then to take her on my lap and just hold her for a while. Someday, I hope, she'll ask again, But here, right now, I want to pretend she's a grown-up. I want to tell her exactly what happened, or what I remember happening. And then I want to say to her that as a little girl, she was absolutely right. This is why I keep telling war stories. He was a short, slender young man of about 20. I was afraid of him, afraid of something. And as he passed me on the trail, I threw a grenade that landed at his feet and killed him. Or to go back. Shortly after midnight, we moved into the ambush site outside a little village called Miquet. The whole platoon was there, maybe 30 of us, spread out in the dense brush along the trail. And for 5 hours, nothing at all happened. We were working in two-man teams, one man on guard while the other slept, switching off every 2 hours. And I remember it was still dark when my friend Kiowa shook me awake for the final watch. The night was foggy and hot. For the first few moments, I felt lost, not sure about directions, groping for my helmet and my weapon. I reached out and found 3 grenades and lined them up in front of me. The pins had already been straightened for quick throwing. And then, for maybe half an hour, I just kneeled there in the dark and waited. Very gradually, in tiny slivers, dawn began to break through the morning fog. And from my position in the brush, I could see 10 or 15 meters up the trail. The mosquitoes were fierce. I remember slapping at them, wondering if I should wake up Kiowa and ask for some repellent, then thinking that was a bad idea, and then looking up and seeing the young man come out of the morning fog. He wore black clothing, rubber sandals, and a gray ammunition belt. His shoulders were slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side as if listening for something. He seemed at ease. He carried his weapon in one hand, muzzle down, moving without any hurry up the center of the trail. There was no sound at all, none, or none that I can remember. And in a way, it seemed he was part of the fog, or part of my own imagination. But there was also the reality of what was happening in my stomach. I had already pulled the pin on a grenade, and we'd come up to a crouch. It was entirely automatic. I didn't hate the young man. I didn't see him as the enemy. I didn't ponder issues of patriotism or military duty. I crouched and kept my head down. I tried to swallow whatever was rising from my stomach, which tasted like lemonade, something fruity and sour. I was terrified. There were no thoughts about killing. The grenade was to make him go away, just evaporate. And I leaned back and I felt my head go empty and then felt it fill up again. I'd already thrown the grenade before thinking throw it. It was gone. The brush was thick and I had to lob it high, not aiming. And I remember that grenade seeming to freeze above me for just an instant, as if a camera had clicked. And I remember ducking down and holding my breath and seeing little wisps of fog rise from the earth. The grenade bounced once and rolled across the trail. I didn't hear it, but there must have been a sound, because the young man dropped his weapon and began to run. Just 2, 3 quick steps. Then he stopped, turned to his right, looked down at the grenade, and tried to cover his head, but never did. It occurred to me then that he was about to die. I wanted to warn him. The grenade made a popping noise, not soft, but not loud either. Not what you'd expect. And there was a puff of dust and smoke, small white puff. And the young man seemed to jerk upward, as if pulled by invisible wires. He fell on his back. His rubber sandals had been blown off. He lay at the center of the trail, his right leg bent beneath him, his one eye shut, his other eye a huge star-shaped hole. For me, it was not a matter of live or die. I was in no real danger. Almost certainly, the young man would have passed me by. And it will always be that way. Later, I remember Kiowa tried to tell me that the man would have died anyway. He told me that it was a good kill. He told me I was a soldier. This was a war. And that I should shape up and stop staring and ask myself what the dead man would have done if things were reversed. But you see, none of that mattered. The words were way too complicated. All I could do was gape at the fact of the young man's body. Even now, 4 decades later, I have not finished sorting it out. Sometimes I forgive myself. Other times I don't. In the ordinary hours of life, I try not to dwell on it. But now and then, when I'm reading a newspaper or just sitting alone in a room, I'll look up and I'll see the young man step out of the morning fog. I'll watch him walk toward me. His shoulders slightly stooped, his head cocked to the side, and he'll pass within a few yards of me and suddenly smile at some secret thought, and then continue up the trail to where it bends back into the morning fog. Well, why do I pick this little chapter out of all the possibilities? One is that it's short. I could read it in a hurry. That's a pretty good reason to pick it. But there are reasons beyond that. One of them is that it's a story that gives a face to that which is largely anonymous in warfare. Even now, if you turn on the Fox channel or CNN and you get what you basically get from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is 8 guys died today in an IED in, Baghdad, and that's it. You get a number and maybe a place, and that's it. But you get very little beyond that. It's a story in which statistics are, at least for a moment, pushed aside in favor of looking at just one small human death. In this case, the death of an enemy soldier, but it could just as well be a death of one of my friends. Death is death. It's the central and abiding certainty of war. It's what wars are for. They're to kill people. It's the ultimate reality, a kind of sanctioned homicide. So it's a story in which a single death is lingered over for a while and magnified, and not just summarized by the way of those statistics we hear. Secondly, I selected this chapter largely because it's made up. It's not true. No Kathleen, as I mentioned earlier. I have no daughter. But on top of that, no hand grenade, no Kiowa, no trail junction, no morning fog, no star-shaped hole. All those details, in fact, all the details, not just those, are the product of a novelist's imagination. And yet, in a much more important way, that story is completely and utterly true. Truer than the truth. As a soldier more than 40 years ago, I participated in dozens, scores, maybe 50 ambushes over the course of my tour, sometimes a whole week worth of ambushes every single night. And the story is a way of gathering together all that terror and all those long nights lying in the dark, waiting to die or to kill, one or the other, into one story focused in time and in energy and geography, a single trail junction of trying to bring together those myriad of forgotten places and forgotten nights that was my time in Vietnam into something you might see and smell and feel, the taste of lemonade in your throat, that fruity, sour taste of imminent death. It's a way of collapsing my own thoughts years afterward, looking back on those long nights into a single event, in the hope that you might feel, as you listen to that little story, something of what I felt 4 decades ago, but also something of what soldiers this moment are feeling around this globe of ours, the same kinds of emotions. There was, though, one particular ambush that I've drawn on for this story, and I'm going to try not to look at my notes here as I talk about this ambush because it's the event that made me want to write this story. It was somewhere in July '69. My company was encamped on some nameless hill in Quang Ngai province in Vietnam. And at about 2 in the morning, my company commander had sent out his lieutenants to wake us all up, a whole company of us, about 100, 105, 110 men. In the middle of the night, we all saddled up. We put on our, rucksacks and grabbed our weapons and ammo and rations and all this, and we began walking through the Vietnam dark. We had no idea where we were going or why we were going where we were going. All we knew was that we were going. We were told it was an ambush, which is a strange word for a company operation. Those of you who are in the military know that most ambushes are done by squad-sized to platoon-sized elements, not by whole companies. So we kind of talked about this. What kind of operation is this? We clinked around through the dark. We're young and stupid, and canteens rattling and cigarettes lighting up in the dark, the way stupid soldiers do and have done since the days of Homer. We arrived around 4 in the morning at a nameless Vietnamese village, a place I didn't know the name of it then. I still don't. The idea of this operation was that our company would surround the place. It was called a cordon. And 3 of our platoons, 3/4 of these guys, would at dawn press through the village where apparently the VC had been fixed by intelligence. The final platoon, the 4th platoon, my own, was lined up along a paddy dike outside the village. And the idea was to press the Viet Cong out of the village and into a rice paddy where we'd just gun them down. These operations never worked. They look too beautiful on paper to ever actually work in reality, partly because of who we were. We were lighting cigarettes and making noise and guys farting in the dark and all kinds of horseplay going on, yakking about their hometowns. And for very practical, petty reasons, these things didn't work. And then for higher reasons, too. For example, the people who did intelligence were just the opposite. They ought to be doing, dumbness ought to be there. They didn't know where any of the Viet Cong ever were. They had no idea. If they say the Viet Cong aren't there, that's where they were. So you sort of went the opposite way. And I'm not much exaggerating. Those of you who know how bad the intelligence was in Vietnam know what I'm talking about on the ground level. In any case, these things just didn't work. This one did, for reasons I'm not quite sure. It was our only successful ambush. In a way, it worked. At about dawn, I remember I was among the people lined up along this paddy dike. At about dawn, the 3 platoons swept through the village, and I can remember the purple kind of pre-light light. Right before dawn has actually come up, and the sky got a little sliver of light across it, kind of purpley colored. And as I was looking to this little sliver of purple light, 3 figures came out of the village from my right to left. And you're the rice paddy out here. They were plainly Viet Cong soldiers. That is to say, they had weapons, and they were the enemy. And I was astonished. It was my first, and only on one other occasion did I ever see the living enemy in Vietnam. I was shot at all the time, but it was always chaotic and confusion, or bamboo and banana trees and hedges, and I just didn't see the enemy. Maybe because I was ducking all the time. It's probably why. I did not want to look. And I would tend to fight my war with my head down and my rifle going like this, and full automatic, just to kind of make them all go away. But in any case, there were three figures clearly distinguishable as the enemy, as far away as, I don't know, the sixth row here, not very far away, 15 meters, 20 meters, something like that. And there were about 25 of us lined up along this paddy dike. We all opened up on everything we had. We had one M60 machine gun, and we had a bunch of, rifles. We had M79 grenade launchers. We had 3 claymores set up out in front of us. Everything we had, we just blasted at these 3 guys 15 yards away, or 15 meters away. About 20 minutes later, when full light had come up, we went out into the paddy, and we found one dead Viet Cong soldier. He was really dead. I mean, he was deader than dead gets. He was just smashed. However, the other 2, not a sign of them. What does that tell you about our aim, for example? I mean, what does it tell you about fear and chaos and darkness? And I know I didn't aim, and I doubt any of my fellow soldiers did, my buddies. I did not, like the character in the story I read to you, I did not look at that body. I had, by that point in my tour, I'd seen more than enough corpses to last me to eternity. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I did not stare at that body. I would look at bodies, by that point in my tour, just obliquely, out of the corner of my eye, the way you might look at a squirrel dead along the pavement. As you walk by, you don't want to confront the ugliness and the nastiness and the death of it. And I was pretty much that way by that point in my tour, almost averting my eye from the consequences of war, not wanting to look at it. Though, this character in the story, I too felt an almost overwhelming crush of responsibility, and one might even say guilt, for the death of that soldier. He was no longer the enemy, and that, if anybody's been in combat knows that once there's a dead 16-year-old kid lying there, the word enemy is utterly inappropriate. That could be you, just as easily. And I probably had much more in common with that dead kid than I had with anybody, in the Kiwanis Club in my hometown, or out at the country club, or, in the Baptist church. I had a lot more we just shared of experience, of horror, and of probably even cynicism and bitterness. I will never know whether a bullet from my weapon killed that kid. It's beyond knowing. 25 of us were firing and throwing grenades and setting off claymores. How am I to know whether a bullet from my weapon hit that kid? Maybe, maybe not. However, in a story, unlike the real world, I can assume responsibility. I was there. I was a soldier. I pulled the trigger. And to say that I'm not responsible, or that I don't know if I'm responsible, is an absolute and utter cop-out. I am responsible. Just like the guy in Dubuque is responsible for forgetting to vote earlier in November. He's responsible too. And in a story, I can take responsibility. I can confront my own complicity in that particular horror. Beyond that, in a story, I can help make myself feel again in a way that I found I couldn't feel for all those years after the war, like so many of my brothers, not just of Vietnam, but brothers I encounter now coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan, that deadness inside you, that inability to look at what you've just gone through, to confront it, to stare at it. Even in your dreams, you jerk awake at night trying to get away from it. In a story, I can look at things that I couldn't look at for all those years, my own history, my own past. Granted, the details in Ambush are all invented. It's fiction. But the story is true to my own nightmares, my own memory, and my own emotions all these years later. Like that character in the story, I can be sitting around, all by myself in a room, just reading the paper or, practicing a little chess move, and suddenly I'm out of that paper, and that young man is coming out of that village. Only there are 3 of them. And I'm back in Vietnam, a 21-year-old kid, pulling the trigger on that weapon. Another reason, I'm almost done here, another reason I wanted to focus on this story is that it addresses some of these questions of truth that you, I'm sure, as readers ask yourself about the book. What's true? What really happened and what didn't? I'm not quite sure why you care, but I guess you do. I mean, at least people in colleges and high schools, they really seem to take the literal, really, it really means a lot. But what they don't know at that age is that they're going to die. And, 1,000 years are going to pass, and everything that we care about, did it happen or not, just erased by history. It's just all gone. Vietnam will end up a little footnote, if that. 1,000, 1,500 years. What do we know about the Battle of Hastings? Almost nothing. What do we know about the Trojan Wars? We have some archaeology, and we have Homer, and that's it. Nothing else. A few other, writers, but not many. 2 or 3 others. We're left with stories. That's what we're really left with, even from now the Civil War, which is relatively recent history, which is also rapidly. So why you care, I don't know. But people do care. What's true and what's not? And what the book is partly aimed at doing is trying to undermine this common sense, black and white notion of what truth is. A firm grasp of what's true and what's false is elusive to a 21-year-old kid squatting in a rice paddy in Vietnam. Is it true, as your minister said back in Worthington, Minnesota, thou shalt not kill? Is that true? When your first sergeant is saying you'd better kill, or I'll court-martial your ass, who's telling the truth? They can't both be telling the truth. It's an example I used at Marymount today, and I think it's a meaningful one. When you're in a situation like that, truth begins to, like the Doppler effect, begins to sort of speed away from you. And you're not quite sure of all kinds of truths, who you are. Am I the kind of person that would pull the trigger on, 3 guys that can't even see me coming out of a village? Well, I didn't think I was when I grew up in Worthington, Minnesota. I found out otherwise in the war. But who's the real Tim O'Brien? Which goes to blur in the book as to, is Tim O'Brien the author, the Tim O'Brien and the character? The answer is, I don't know. It's a mystery to me. Americans in particular, but maybe all of us in general as human beings, tend to think of the truths as these fixed, absolute things. But truths are not. Truths can vary by where you are. I could say to you now, it's, what time is it? It's 7:45. It's true in Virginia, but it's not true in LA or on Neptune, is it? So what's true here ain't true there. And truths also change. They're fluid and they evolve. What's true in the year 1964, when you declare to yourself, I love Sally, may not be true in 1965. I love, Jenna, which may not be true in 1966. We've all undergone that evolution of what seems fixed truth. They evolve and they change. And that process is hyped up and exaggerated and revved up when you're in a situation of life or death. All the old truths, civility is a decent thing, suddenly gets warped when you're in a situation of endless stress and endless terror. A place like, say, Vietnam, or a place like, say, Afghanistan, or a place like Iwo Jima. The book is meant to make you wonder and question in yourself, what is it that I can hold on to firmly as being true, and absolutely, indelibly, and forever true. Another reason that I wrote the book as I did, and this is the last thing I'm going to say before taking your questions, is that I'm especially skeptical, having returned from a place like Vietnam, of truth with a capital T. It scares me. Those fanatical, self-righteous, zealous, I'm right and you're wrong declarations of what's true and what's right and wrong that you hear from the pulpit and you hear on CNN and the Fox channel, until it drives me, I want to say, how do you know? So with such absolutism, what's true or not? Muhammad Atta, the guy who flew one of those airplanes into the World Trade Center, he thought he knew the truth worth killing for, dying for. And I don't want us to turn into that fanatical, zealous, I'm right, you're wrong, black or white, self-righteous, pious, holier than thou sense of I know and you don't, what the truth is. Having gone through a thing like Vietnam, and also like a thing like being a parent, I think it's more important to have a little humility. And maybe you use the words I think, or maybe, could be, but not that kind of that shrill, strident, those shrill, strident declarations of truth. The book is aimed pretty directly at that, and it partly explains why the book is written as it is. Yeah, I'm going to stop now. I had a lot more written down here I wanted to say, but I'm going to pause and do what's more fun for me, anyways. Just take your questions and.
For people who have questions, Holly and I have.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so if you have questions, raise your hand. Please wait until one of us hand you a mic before you ask your question.
I'm wondering if you have discovered there is an American way of thinking about killing and death. Do Taliban young men come down with PTSD?
What a great. Well, I thought I'd heard every damn question that existed, and I don't know. I would assume so. You know, one thing about your question is really interesting to me, because we, as soldiers on one side of a thing, view the enemy as somehow less than wholly human, not capable, that is, of getting, having post-traumatic stress syndrome. The rhetoric of anybody who's been in the Army of basic training and AIT is to dehumanize the enemy so that they're not even really people. They're gooks, dinks, slants, jerrys, japs, whatever the word may be, that kind of racist talk. And partly that's why I wrote that story I just read, that kid lying dead out in that rice paddy was a human being. And in another chapter, I gave him a whole history, an invented history. It was largely my own. I just gave it to the dead kid, the enemy soldier. But my humanity tells me that one cannot go through the taking of human life and watching your fellow soldiers die on your side without suffering something. That it seems to me that post-traumatic stress syndrome is a given when you go to war. The Veterans Administration, if you go into a doctor's office and you're smoking, they're going to tell you to stop smoking. If it's preventative medicine. And that's what the VA should be doing. It's the only way to cure, post-traumatic stress syndrome that's combat-related is to stop war. Because as long as you have it, you'd be crazy if you weren't crazy. When you came home from a thing like that, you'd be nuts not to be suffering, not to want to have a drink or two, not to want to smoke some dope. You'd be crazy to get along happily with everybody. Just like that, you'd be nuts. And it's just a given when you send people off. And I can't believe that enemy soldiers don't. With Vietnam, I went back to Vietnam in '94 and met a bunch of my, what we called the enemy, all throughout the country. And what struck me was that they were human beings with senses of humor and jokes about how small they were, and that's why we couldn't hit them. And and all that. It was just they were human. So I'm sure that members of the Taliban and of Al Qaeda, have got to have their own suffering. It's hard to think of it this way. You got to turn your mind upside down. But it's a good thing to bear in mind that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. You may not like it. You may totally disagree, but that's their opinion. And it's unreal. It's like putting your head in the sand to think otherwise. And we may think, oh, yeah, we debate it. But you're not going to erase what people feel about why they're going to war. The same with any enemy we may have. And this demonization of enemies has pursued me for 40 years now because I, too, am guilty of it. My time in Vietnam was I learned to just despise anything that moved in that country. Man, beast, tree, if it moved, I hated it because I could never find the enemy. I mean, there's no uniforms, no up, no down, no front, no rear. They found us, But on only very, very rare occasions did we ever, truly find them. The story I just told you about was one of those occasions. I forgot to tell you the end of that story. This was our successful ambush. An hour later, my best friend, a kid from Orlando, Florida, his real name is Alvin Merricks. You can find him on the wall. We called him Chip. I didn't even know his real first name until he died. He was in the same village over here. He stepped on a booby-trapped either mortar round or artillery round, we're not sure, and it blew him into this tree. Dead as, so dead you'd never know he was once black. He was just yellow and red. That's our most successful ambush. My best friend being blown into a trillion pieces into a tree in that country. That was our best one. Imagine what the bad ones were like.
Yes, I appreciate your remarks about being able to talk about or being able to write the truth as you write fiction, and that stories can be true although they're products of imagination.
Right.
I think when we read the things they carried, we read that Tim O'Brien was a soldier in Vietnam, and maybe we wonder, and maybe we don't, about whether you're writing
Right.
your experiences or not. But we know you're there. You were there. And I'm wondering whether you think that you reach a truth as you write fiction about Vietnam by virtue of the fact that you were there.
I
That
do.
is, would it be a different kind of truth if you wrote a novel about Vietnam but had never been there?
I think it would be a different kind of truth. That's a just totally fascinating question. I got the right audience tonight because they're new questions that I really haven't encountered. It would be a different kind of truth. If I, for example, were a Stephen Crane who had never been, in the Civil War, he would write his own kind of book. It would be based on emotional things I brought to the material. Let's say I went to Winnipeg and I wrote a book about being in Vietnam while I'm living in Winnipeg rather than went to Canada. Or went to jail and wrote a book from a jail cell about what being a soldier would be. It would be a different kind of book. It would be informed by jail or by Winnipeg. And it would have a different taste to it, and I'm sure the content of the book would be different. I doubt the chapter I just read would be in it. I doubt the Sweetheart of the Song Trebong story would be in that book, a story about the girl who goes over to Vietnam. Because it would have seemed, having not been there, it would have seemed, oh, that's impossible, and what a silly story to write. Whereas if you go through the upside-down Alice in Wonderland world of Vietnam, it doesn't seem as silly to me as it does to most civilians. Think, that couldn't have happened, impossible. So I think the content would have been different. I really do. On the other hand, I got to say that I think had I not gone to Vietnam, I would have still been circling the moral terrain, but I would have been circling it from the perspective of Canada, let's say, as an exile who had walked away from his country and hadn't gone to the war. And although I wouldn't be writing probably directly about combat experiences, I'd be writing about many of the same moral issues. How do you decide what to do with your body in a situation of moral ambiguity? I love that and I love this. I want that and I want this, but you can't have them both. And I think that moral terrain, which was the province of all of us who lived through that era, of having to make our minds up and put our bodies where our minds are going. You couldn't do nothing. Doing nothing was doing something. And that terrain, I think, would have stayed with me. I'm not in charge of calling on anybody, so I can't really do right here, okay?
Following up on what you were just saying, I was very impressed by the passage in the book where you described almost but not quite going over the border into Canada, and you spent these days thinking about it just south of the border. As a GI who was in the service about the same time you were, that really got to me. But I really would like to know something, looking back on this. Do you think you made the right decision?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I have these two heads about everything in the world. Sometimes I think I did the right thing. Other things I think I made a cowardly and disastrous and even catastrophic choice for my own life. And I lie in bed at night, and when I do think about Vietnam, it's pretty much that I think about, that choice. It's not Nam that I remember so much. It's the summer before going to Vietnam that I thought I was going to go crazy. I mean, what do? Get on a Greyhound bus and you're 21 years old and head for Canada, and it seemed worse than charging an enemy bunker. It seemed worse than putting a bullet to my head. It seemed worse than anything. And yet it felt like the right thing to do at the same time, and I couldn't summon the courage to get on that Greyhound or get in my car and head north. And so I ended up in the war by a kind of default. I didn't choose to go, really. I just sort of let my body be taken. I showed up at the Worthington, Minnesota bus station, and I got on not a Greyhound, but I got on a, whatever they had a competitor back then. And that bus went to, yeah, that was a Trailways, yeah. And the Trailways bus took me to Sioux Falls, and there I held my hand up, and like a sleepwalker, found myself, saying, I was in the Army. But I can't remember choosing to do that. I just felt as if my body were being taken there, the way it was taken when I was young to church, where I went kind of reluctantly with, my body being dragged and my spirit out on the baseball field where I wanted to be. And, and during that hour of counting bricks, I'd count the bricks going this way, then I'd count them going that way in the church. Then I'd do the multiplication in my head. And this is at 9 or 10 years old. As I was there's something very mechanical about my imagination back then. So among the things that I brought home with me is I'm a changed person by that moral choice that summer of, or that's the word, that moral quandary or debate going on inside me that is hard to replicate, and it's impossible to do it unless for me through fiction. If I were to tell you the literal truth of that summer, all I would tell you, it'd be true, but I would bore you to tears. I would say I played golf, and I'd recount the bogeys and pars and best I could, and I would tell you I laid in bed at night worrying about the draft, and that'd be pretty much it. And you'd be asleep because it wouldn't do anything to you. Whereas, even though it's true, the story of the kid going up with my name to the border and with old Elroy and the Rainy River and should I cross the river, it's all invented. But through fiction and through the interchanges between Elroy and the character, and between that demarcation line, that river that can be crossed or not crossed, with all those people standing on each bank of the river, the Statue of Liberty and Jane Fonda and Abby Hoffman and Westmoreland, they're all yelling at you one way or the other, the way it felt like the whole country was yelling at me, do this, do that. It felt like there were cheerleaders with pom-poms, go Hanoi, and others on the other side. That's how it felt that summer. So, of course, it's invented, but it at least gets closer in its emotional feel for me, just as a reader of the story, than anything that I could write truthfully, in the literal sense about that summer.
Could you give us a little insight into the story about the girl who came over? You just mentioned that.
I can talk a little about this. Her name in the story is Mary Ann Bell, and like all you who read it, I didn't believe a word of it when I first heard the story. I heard it in Nam, right after getting in country. I got to my what they call my terminal unit, which is a scary phrase, so we end up. And among them, I remember filling sandbags. The guys were in on stand down. It was one of those few times they were back on the fire base. And this guy said, yeah, he told me the story. This guy got his girlfriend over a couple of years earlier, said she was up in this Trebong Special Forces camp, a place that really existed. And I'd look up at the mountains, and I thought, oh, you're crazy, you're making this up. And then I'd hear it again, and then I'd hear it again, and then again. And after a while, I began asking myself, well, why don't I believe it? And the only answer I had was, it was a woman, period. If that were a male, that would, that same age, there were 500,000 of us just like her, fresh out of high schools around the country. It was purely and only gender that I didn't believe that story. But I still didn't believe it. I came back home, I wrote a couple of books, and I was out in Seattle, near where I'd done my basic in AIT, doing a book signing at a bookstore out there called Elliott Bay. And there was a crowd kind of like this, and I signed a boatload of books, and near the end of this long line, I signed for maybe an hour and a half, a guy came through of roughly my age, and he said, have you ever, he knew where I'd served in Vietnam. I talked about, this place where I served in Quang Ngai province. He said, did you ever hear the story of this woman who was up at this Special Forces camp, the Trabong camp? And I said, yeah, I'd heard it a lot. I heard it many times. And he said, I was there. It happened. Nobody believes me. I've talked about it for, they just laughed me off as a tall tale teller. And he said, it's pissing me off. I just can't believe, why wouldn't you believe it? You believe all the other silly shit you hear about what happens in this country, the most crazy imaginable stories of GIs being attacked by tigers and the elephants tromping on you. And Marines and Army guys tell these stories with absolute impunity. They have the impunity of being a vet. They can say any damn thing they want, and they won't believe me about a story that really was true. She was there. And so I said, let's go and have a cup of coffee after this was over, and we ended up not having coffee. We had a couple of drinks together. And he really couldn't let it go. I kind of wanted to move on to other topics, but he was just so wanted me to believe him. The way that I used the Rat Kiley character in the story, Rat was just desperate to please believe me. You've seen all this other stuff happening. Why won't you believe this? And he'd say things like, what's to stop her? I mean, you can buy a plane ticket in Cleveland and you can fly to LA and it's not improbable. And if you get to LA, you can buy another plane ticket to go to Bangkok. Nobody will stop you. It's totally legal. You get to Bangkok, you can fly, any civilian from Bangkok could fly into Saigon back in those days. You didn't need to even, I don't think even have a passport. You just did it. And if you couldn't fly, there are plenty of surreptitious ways of getting into that place. And once you're in Saigon and you're an 18-year-old cheerleader, I mean, you got 500,000 guys take you anywhere you want to go in country. All you got to say is please, and you're gone. So it's not logistically illogical. There's nothing illogical about it. On top of that, I began thinking that, this is before I began writing the story, but I began thinking that, a lot of women served in Vietnam. There's a statue out on the mall to them here. I'm sure you know that, right? And they were not just nurses, but I've run into, I don't know how many, we called them donut dollies back in Nam. They'd visit fire bases and they'd give you Kool-Aid and kind of ersatz sex. They'd sort of wiggle their butts a little bit and you'd have to sort of take that until you got home. They'd, what else? I mean, there were people, just women working for contractors. There were journalists. And then I began thinking of a special woman whom I had met in my life who had spent a year. Her name's Lady Borton. I think probably in this library there's a book that she wrote called After Sorrow. This is to prove her existence to you, because I'm like this guy now. Like, I don't think anybody's going to believe this. So I've turned into this guy. But you can go in that card catalog, I'll bet you, and find her. She lived in a place called Quang Ngai City, which was not a city. It was a little town, a little dirty, filthy town right near where the My Lai massacre happened, maybe 8 miles away, 7 miles, not very far. It was a place where we, American soldiers, a whole company of us armed to the teeth, we were afraid of this place. It was scary and dangerous place. The town was just littered with landmines of all sorts all around the town. You didn't want to go there. She lived there for a year all by herself as a Quaker helper of refugees. She was, helping refugees in Quang Ngai City. Incredibly brave. She's still, I think, in Vietnam. After all these years, here we are, all us proud vets back home. War's been over for 4 decades, not for her. And like Marianne Bell, she's out there. And I want to write about that story. You can see it kind of gets to me even for all this time. It may strike you as fabulous, impossible, fairy tale, but you meet Lady Borton and you will not think so.
Yeah, related to this discussion of what is truth and what is fiction, I was wondering if you had read James Fry's book, Million Little Pieces, and whether you had a reaction to the uproar that
Well, he was doing the opposite of what I was doing. He was billing his work as nonfiction, even though it was fiction. And I'm calling mine fiction and not nonfiction. They're totally different enterprises. I give myself license. When I write, it's fiction. I give myself license to do any damn thing I want to do. I can make up the most crazy story, and it's fiction. What hurt me was I heard him on TV citing the things they carried as a source for what he was doing, and that got to me, that he was relying on something. I don't think he understood the difference between, I'm going to tell you, make-believe or I'm going to tell you the truth. And they're two different enterprises. If I were to announce for you, this is nonfiction, I'd better deliver nonfiction as best I can. As problematical as that is, I mean, writing nonfiction is a hard thing. I learned that at the Post over 2 years working at the Washington Post, that you don't try to lie, but every reporter knows what happens. You go out on a story, you come back, the editor says, give me 15 column inches, and you deliver 15 column inches of truth. However, you toss out that truth, that quote, that observation, they all go to hit the 15 inches. So you get 15 inches of truth. Is that the truth? I mean, or 18, or whatever the number is. And it's not just true of reporters, it's true of textbook writers. I mean, how do you write a history of World War II that's wholly true, that wholly incorporates everything? You can't put every thought of every soldier on all the sides of that war into that book. You're selective, and you organize, and you throw most of the stuff out, even though it's true. That whole principle of selectivity when you're writing nonfiction seems almost anti-truth. It can't be wholly true, and if it's not wholly true, is it a half-truth, as we called it in Minnesota when I was growing up, or is it a millionth truth? Well, I don't know the answer to that. I do know there are many problems associated with writing nonfiction, because I experienced them in writing my first book. I tried to write a memoir that was faithful to what I went through, and I did. However, I knew I was leaving stuff out, and I knew my memory was faulty. And even if my memory had been great, I still couldn't remember all the dialogue that was spoken around me, the exact words coming out of that soldier's mouth and that. And so I'd find myself inventing, not out of whole cloth, but out of partial cloth. I remember the tone of what somebody said, and so I try to capture the tone through through invention. The way almost virtually every nonfiction writer is going to do when you go to write a memoir, unless you've got a tape recorder running all through NOM. And then you got a battery problem, and you got all kinds of, how do you hold a microphone, like interview the VC before you have your firefight? It's really hard. So I quickly moved from the Fry world to the world of where I felt a permissiveness or a license to invent in the service of truth. I mean, my goal is to try to be faithful to certain emotional and spiritual and even physical things that I can only express through story. And that Rainy River chapter is, for me, the best example in the book. So let's do one more and we'll wrap her up. Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
In things that carry, courage was not always a matter of yes or no. Sometimes it came to degree, like cold. Sometimes you were very brave up to a point. And what you were saying earlier about the truth being like something that you could view ambiguous, is that the same thing too as courage?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, courage for me, the greatest act of courage I showed in Vietnam was simply to keep humping. And it sounds stupid and trivial, but to keep your legs moving when every cell in my body was, I want to quit, I want to drop, I don't want to do this anymore. Every cell said, don't do it anymore. And I could have. All you have to do is fall. And what are they can't stop you from falling. And what are they going to do to you if you do? They can't send you to Nam. You're there. That was the worst that could happen. They could probably try to, Article 15 you, but you're talking about your life. I mean, I'll take the Article 15 any day if it's my life or my legs. And yet I kept humping. I kept walking. I did it. And on the surface, it probably would not have looked very brave. But man, when you've got landmines all over the place and booby traps, and you see guys with their legs going left and right and arms, and you keep your legs moving. So just the endless march through the paddies and through the mean little villes and up into the mountains and down and around the paddies, and you just keep moving like a mule or a donkey, just trudging on, bearing all that weight. It felt like, man, I am doing something brave. With every breath I'd suck in, and I wouldn't fall and keep going forward. I know it doesn't sound like much, but I think it's the reason behind combat soldiers so treasuring and valuing the CIB, the Combat Infantryman's Badge, that that is a sign of you were in combat. That it's not acts of conspicuous valor necessarily, though there are plenty of those. but it's that daily, almost petty act of enduring, of just keep going, willing yourself through a kind of incredible volition of willpower to keep going forward when all you want to do is, oh man, drop to the ground and let some chopper come down and take you away up high and light and over the clouds and, you know, back to Cameron, and then let some big plane come pick you up and take you to Japan, and from there to Seattle, and it's over. And you might spend the rest of your life in jail, but man, I'm breathing, you know, in that jail. And all of us, the guys from West Point to the, you know, the poor guy out of, you know, Harlem, we all felt that impulse of, man, I don't want to die in this mean, godforsaken spot on the planet. No matter how, you know, gung-ho these guys were when they showed up. My CO was a graduate of all places of Annapolis, and my company commander who had transferred to the Army afterward, the moron. And even he, a pretty gung-ho, you know, graduate of the Naval Academy, ended up his time in Vietnam with a new realism about it all, that some of that romanticism and naivete had been taken out of him just by the life of the war, that petty cobweb of daily, unending nastiness, which is war. Not always bombs, not always bullets, sometimes just little petty things like, you know, beating up on a kid or, you know, interrogating, you know, some old man in a village, UVC, and snapping at him and right in his face, and the poor guy doesn't know a word of English. And you don't know, if he doesn't know what you're asking him. And just picture this lieutenant in this guy's face just screaming at him. Well, no blood was drawn, nobody died, but it was an act of incredible indecency and incredible stupidity. You know, trying to get words out of stone when you don't know a language and screaming at that guy, UVC. And you multiply that by, you know, 80 times a day, and then you multiply that by all the infantry platoons and companies operating in that country, and you get that matrix of sin and of evil, which is war, that's so hard to communicate. You can communicate battles and you can communicate deaths, but you can't, it's hard to communicate that cobwebby feeling of moment by moment sin, which is war. Okay, I'm going to thank you all for coming tonight, and I'll be glad to sign your book.